the Mafia boss's wife was jealous of the black maid, until she learned the real reason why the Castellano estate sat on 11 acres of manicured silence, the kind of property that announced itself through absence. No neighbors close enough to hear anything, no roads visible from the windows, no world beyond the iron gates that didn't require permission to exist. Vivian Castellano had chosen every piece of furniture in this house: the Italian marble in the foyer, the hand-blown Murano chandeliers, the silk drapes that cost more than most people's cars. She had decorated this prison with exquisite taste, and for 7 years she had convinced herself it was a palace. But lately, the walls felt closer. She stood at the bedroom window that March morning, watching the sunrise paint the gardens gold, and she noticed the figure moving through the rose beds below. Grace, the housekeeper, already working at 6:15, her dark hands moving among the thorns with a gentleness that seemed almost musical. Vivian's jaw tightened. She couldn't explain when the feeling had started, this hot, irrational thing that lived in her chest whenever she saw Grace moving through her home. It wasn't logical. Grace had worked for them for 3 years. She was quiet, efficient, nearly invisible in the way good household staff learned to be. She never overstepped, never lingered, never drew attention. And yet, Vivian had started noticing things. The way Marco's eyes followed Grace when she entered a room, the way his voice softened when he spoke to her, a warmth he hadn't offered Vivian in years. The way Grace's presence seemed to calm something in him that Vivian had never been able to reach. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. Marco Castellano was many things. A man who had built an empire on fear and loyalty, who had blood on his hands that no amount of charity galas could wash clean, who had married Vivian when she was 22 and too dazzled by his power to see the cage being built around her. But he wasn't stupid. He wouldn't risk everything for a housekeeper. Would he? She turned from the window and caught her reflection in the vanity mirror. 34 years old. Still beautiful. She spent enough money maintaining that beauty to feed a small country. Blonde hair that took 3 hours at the salon every 6 weeks. A body sculpted by personal trainers and careful starvation. Designer clothes that hung in closets the size of apartments. And yet, she felt invisible in her own home. Downstairs, the house was already humming with morning routines. Vivian descended the curved staircase in silk pajamas and a cashmere robe, performing the role of lady of the manor, even when her only audience was staff. The kitchen smelled of fresh coffee and something baking. Grace is doing, probably. The woman seemed incapable of starting a day without creating something warm. Marco sat at the breakfast table, reading the Financial Times, a cup of espresso cooling at his elbow. At 51, he still carried the dangerous elegance that had first drawn Vivian to him. Salt and pepper hair, a face that could shift from charm to menace without warning, hands that had held her tenderly and signed death warrants with equal ease. He didn't look up when she entered. "Good morning," Vivian said, pouring herself coffee she wouldn't drink. "Morning." His eyes never left the paper. Grace entered from the kitchen, carrying a tray of pastries. She moved with that particular efficiency Vivian had come to resent. Every gesture purposeful, nothing wasted. Her uniform was simple: black dress, white apron, sensible shoes. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun. She wore no jewelry, no makeup, nothing that called attention. And still, Marco looked up. "Grace." His voice carried something it never carried for Vivian anymore. Recognition. Presence. "Those smell incredible. Almond croissants, Mr. Castellano, your favorite." She set the tray down, and their hands brushed, accidentally, briefly, meaninglessly. But Vivian saw it. The way Grace's fingers hesitated for just a fraction of a second. The way Marco's expression flickered with something soft. The hot thing in Vivian's chest flared. "Grace," she said, her voice sharper than intended. "I need to speak with you about the linens. The guest room sheets weren't pressed properly yesterday." Grace turned to her with calm, unreadable eyes. "Of course, Mrs. Castellano. I apologize. I'll see to it immediately." There was nothing defiant in her tone, nothing to criticize, and somehow that made it worse. Marco folded his paper, finally giving Vivian his attention, but only to frown. "The sheets are fine, Vivian. Don't create problems where there aren't any." The dismissal landed like a slap. Grace had already disappeared back into the kitchen, sparing herself the humiliation of witnessing Vivian being corrected in her own home. That was the worst part, Grace's constant, quiet dignity. The way she never seemed to need validation. The way she occupied her role with a peace that Vivian, despite all her wealth and status, couldn't seem to find. "I'm meeting with Salvatore today," Marco said, rising from the table. "I'll be home late. Don't wait up." He kissed her forehead, a gesture so automatic it held no affection, and left. Vivian sat alone in the breakfast room, surrounded by almond croissants she wouldn't eat, in a house she had decorated, married to a man who looked through her. And somewhere in the kitchen, Grace was humming. The day passed in the hollow rhythm that had become Vivian's life. She reviewed menus with the cook, approved flower arrangements for a dinner party she didn't want to host, answered emails from charity committees she had joined to fill the empty hours. She shopped online for things she didn't need. She called friends who were really just wives of Marco's associates, women she couldn't trust with anything real. Through it all, she watched Grace. The woman moved through the house like water, present but unobtrusive, necessary but unremarked. She cleaned rooms with methodical care. She arranged flowers with an artist's eye. She anticipated needs before they were voiced, appearing with fresh towels, chilled water, anything required, then vanishing before gratitude could be offered. Vivian had never really looked at Grace before, not as a person, not as a woman with a life beyond these walls. But now she found herself cataloging details. The way Grace's hands moved when she folded laundry, precise and almost meditative. The fine lines around her eyes that suggested she was older than she appeared, maybe 40, maybe more. The way she carried herself with a quiet authority that required no announcement. In the afternoon, Vivian passed Marco's study and heard voices inside. She paused, her hand on the doorframe, listening. "Can't thank you enough, Mr. Castellano." Grace's voice, softer than usual. "It means everything. You don't need to thank me." Marco's voice held that warmth again, that terrible warmth. "You've earned it. More than earned it." Vivian's heart hammered. She should walk in, demand answers, assert herself as the wife, the lady of this house, the woman who had every right to know what happened under her roof. Instead, she retreated. She told herself it was dignity. She told herself she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of her suspicion, her jealousy, her fear. She told herself she was above such scenes. But the truth was simpler and more shameful. She was afraid of what she might find, afraid that confrontation would confirm the things she dreaded, that somehow, in some way she couldn't name or understand, she was losing her husband to a woman who cleaned their toilets. That night, Marco came home late, as promised. Vivian lay in bed, pretending to sleep, listening to him move through their bathroom routine. He slid between the sheets smelling of cigar smoke and whiskey, business smells, the scent of meetings she wasn't privy to. "I know you're awake," he said quietly. She didn't respond. He sighed, rolled onto his side, and within minutes, his breathing deepened into sleep. Vivian stared at the ceiling for hours, the darkness pressing down like a confession she wasn't ready to make. She was jealous of Grace. There. The truth she had been circling for months. She was jealous of a black woman who earned in a year what Vivian spent on handbags. She was jealous of someone who lived in a small room on the 3rd floor and owned nothing that would fit in a designer boutique. And the shame of that jealousy made everything worse, because Vivian knew what she was supposed to feel. Superiority, perhaps, or at worst, indifference. She was the wife. She had the ring, the name, the legal claim. She slept in Marco's bed, attended his functions, bore the title of Mrs. Castellano. Grace had nothing. Grace was nothing in the eyes of the world they inhabited. And yet, something was wrong. Something she couldn't see, couldn't name, couldn't control. Something that made her husband speak softly to the housekeeper and look through his wife like she was made of glass. The fault line was already there, running through the foundation of her life. She just hadn't learned yet how deep it went. Spring settled over the estate like a held breath. The gardens exploded with color, azaleas, tulips, wisteria climbing the garden walls. But inside the house, something was quietly dying. Vivian began keeping a mental ledger. Every glance between Marco and Grace, every softened word, every moment that felt like intimacy disguised as professionalism. Tuesday. Marco asked Grace to press his shirt for the Carbone meeting, even though he had a closet full of freshly pressed shirts. Thursday. Grace brought Marco coffee in his study at 4 o'clock, the exact time he liked it, prepared exactly how he preferred it. Vivian hadn't known about the 4 o'clock coffee. Saturday. She found them in the garden, talking near the fountain, and when she approached, the conversation died. Mrs. Castellano. Grace had nodded, pleasant and blank, and excused herself to check on something in the kitchen. Marco had watched her go, just for a second, but that second was enough. "What were you talking about?" Vivian asked, hating the neediness in her voice. "Staff matters. The groundskeeper is retiring. Grace was helping me think through replacements." It was plausible. It was reasonable. It was probably even true. And Vivian didn't believe a word of it. She started finding excuses to observe. She would walk through rooms where Grace was working, pretending to inspect. She would arrive at doorways silently, hoping to catch something, anything, that would justify her suspicion. What she caught instead was more confusing. Grace was good at her job, not just competent, exceptional. She ran the household with quiet efficiency, managing the other staff members with firm kindness, solving problems before they became problems, maintaining standards that Vivian herself couldn't have articulated. And she treated Vivian with unfailing respect, even when Vivian's questions were clearly accusations disguised as curiosity, even when her inspections were obviously surveillance, even when her voice carried edges sharp enough to cut. "Mrs. Castellano, would you prefer the lilies in the foyer or the sitting room this week? Mrs. Castellano, shall I adjust the dinner reservation to 8 instead of 7:30? Mrs. Castellano, I noticed your headache medication was running low. I've ordered more from the pharmacy." Always correct, always considerate, always revealing nothing. It made Vivian feel small in a way she couldn't explain. One afternoon, she found herself in Grace's room. She hadn't planned it, or rather, she had convinced herself she hadn't planned it. She was simply inspecting the staff quarters, making sure everything was up to standard. A perfectly reasonable thing for the lady of the house to do. The room was small but immaculate. A single bed with crisp white sheets, a dresser with a few photographs, a small bookshelf crowded with paperbacks, a window overlooking the garden. Grace tended with such care. Vivian moved to the photographs, her heart beating too fast. One showed Grace in graduation robes, not recent but clearly college. The frame was old, the photo faded. Another showed a young boy, grinning at the camera, gap-toothed and innocent. A third showed Grace with an older woman who shared her bone structure, her quiet dignity, mother and daughter, clearly. No pictures of men, no romantic implications, nothing that suggested the torrid affair Vivian had been constructing in her imagination. She felt foolish, she felt relieved, she felt disappointed, and the disappointment shamed her most of all. What did she want? Proof that her husband was unfaithful? Evidence that would justify the cold silence that had become their marriage? Permission to feel the rage and hurt that had been building for years? The door opened behind her. "Mrs. Castellano." Grace's voice was neutral, but her eyes took in the scene with quiet understanding. Vivian standing in her room, clearly snooping, clearly guilty. "Is there something you need?" Vivian's face flushed. "I was just checking that everything was satisfactory. The staff quarters are my responsibility." "Of course." Grace stepped aside, leaving the doorway clear, an exit offered without accusation. "I hope everything meets your standards." There was no sarcasm in her voice, no challenge, and that made it worse. Vivian walked past her, unable to meet her eyes. She made it to her own bedroom before the tears came, hot, angry tears that she didn't fully understand. She wasn't crying about Marco or Grace or the suspicions that had consumed her for weeks. She was crying because she had become someone she despised, a woman who snooped through servants' rooms, who manufactured grievances about linens, who blamed another woman for her husband's emotional absence rather than confronting the man himself. When had she become this person? When had fear and insecurity hollowed her out so completely? The dinner party that Friday night crystallized everything. 20 guests from Marco's world, men with blood on their hands and women who had learned not to ask questions. Vivian played hostess with mechanical perfection, smiling at appropriate moments, making conversation that meant nothing, wearing a dress that cost more than Grace earned in 3 months. Grace moved through the party like a ghost, refilling glasses, clearing plates, ensuring everything ran smoothly. She was invisible in the way good staff learned to be, present only in the effects of her labor, never as a person. But Vivian watched Marco watch her. It wasn't obvious. To anyone else, it would have looked like nothing. A glance here, a nod there. The natural acknowledgement of staff who were doing their jobs well. But Vivian had been studying them for months. She knew the difference. Something passed between them. Not lust. She had looked for lust and never found it. Something deeper, more concerning. An understanding that excluded everyone else in the room. After dessert, Vivian excused herself to the powder room. On her way back, she passed Marco's study and heard voices again. Getting worse. Grace's voice low and urgent. The treatments aren't working the way they hoped. How long? Marco asked. A pause. When Grace spoke again, her voice was thick. Maybe 6 months, maybe less. Vivian pressed herself against the wall, heart racing. I'm sorry, Grace. Marco's voice held something she had never heard in it. Genuine compassion, unguarded and raw. Is there anything else I can do? You've done enough, Mr. Castellano, more than enough. You've been so good to me, to him. I can never repay. Don't. Marco cut her off, but gently. You don't owe me anything. You never have. Vivian retreated before she could hear more, her mind spinning. Treatments, 6 months, him, the boy in the photograph, the gap-toothed grin, Grace's son. Something was wrong with Grace's son. The jealousy that had consumed her for months suddenly shifted, reformed itself into something new. Not better, just different. She still didn't understand what was between Marco and Grace, but it wasn't what she had thought. It wasn't betrayal, at least not the kind she had feared. It was something else entirely. That night, after the guests had gone and Marco had disappeared into his study, Vivian sat alone in the dark living room, watching the cleanup crew, hired for the party, carry away the evidence of an evening that had felt as hollow as her marriage. Grace was directing them efficiently, tireless even at midnight, ensuring nothing was overlooked. Vivian studied her with new eyes, the photographs in Grace's room, the books, novels mostly, but also medical texts that Vivian hadn't registered at the time, the precision of her work, the refusal to ever miss a day, the careful management of every penny she earned, a mother working herself to the bone for a child who was sick. And Marco? What? Helping her? Supporting her? Being kind? The thought should have brought relief. Her husband wasn't having an affair. The touches, the soft words, the private conversations, they weren't what she had feared. But somehow, this was worse. Because Vivian realized, sitting there in the dark, that she had never seen Marco show that kind of care to anyone. That kindness, that softness, that genuine human concern. He was capable of it, apparently. He just hadn't chosen to show it to her. Not once in 7 years. The cracks weren't in her marriage. They were in her. They had always been in her. She just hadn't been brave enough to look. The days that followed were a slow erosion, like watching a coastline disappear into the sea. Vivian stopped looking for evidence of an affair. Instead, she found herself watching Grace with different eyes, cataloging signs of exhaustion she had previously dismissed as poor work ethic. The shadows under Grace's eyes, the way she sometimes paused mid-task, staring at nothing before pulling herself back together. The quiet phone calls she made on her breaks, her voice low and tender in a way Vivian had never heard. She was watching a woman in crisis, and she had spent months hating her for it. The shame was constant now, a low hum beneath everything Vivian did. She found herself being kinder to Grace, not obviously, but in small ways. Taking her own coffee cup to the kitchen instead of leaving it for collection. Saying please and thank you with actual feeling. Trying to make eye contact when she spoke. Grace noticed. Of course she noticed. The woman noticed everything, but she said nothing, just accepted the shift with her usual quiet grace. It made Vivian feel worse. One afternoon, she found Marco in his study, door ajar, speaking on the phone. The best oncologist in the state, I don't care what it costs. And the trial at Johns Hopkins, I want him enrolled if there's any chance. Vivian stepped back, but not before Marco caught her eye. He ended the call abruptly. Eavesdropping, Vivian? The door was open. She stepped into the study, closing it behind her. "Who's sick, Marco?" His expression shuddered. "Business." That wasn't business. That was personal. She moved closer, emboldened by weeks of watching, learning, piecing things together. "Grace's son, isn't it? He's the one who's sick." Marco's jaw tightened. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, "How much do you know?" "Not enough, only what I've overheard and seen." She sat in the chair across from his desk, a position usually reserved for supplicants, for people who needed something from Marco Castellano. "Tell me." He studied her, as if seeing her for the first time in years. "Why do you want to know?" "Because you've been kinder to our housekeeper than you've been to me in 7 years of marriage, and I think I deserve to understand why." The words hung between them, raw and undeniable. Marco leaned back in his chair. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. "Grace's son is 12 years old. His name is Marcus." A pause. "After me." Vivian felt the room tilt. "He has leukemia. Diagnosed 2 years ago, right before Grace started working for us. She needed a job with good pay, flexible hours, and an employer who wouldn't fire her for taking time off for his treatments." Marco's eyes were distant, focused on something Vivian couldn't see. "I offered her a position." "Why?" Vivian's voice came out strangled. "What is he to you?" "Vivian, tell me." She gripped the arms of the chair. "Tell me the truth, Marco. For once in our marriage, tell me something real." The silence stretched. When Marco finally spoke, each word seemed to cost him something. 20 years ago, I was nobody, just a kid from the neighborhood, hungry and stupid and determined to be something. Grace's brother, David, was my best friend, my only friend, really. We ran together, did jobs together, built the beginning of everything I have now. His hand moved to his collar, touching the place where Vivian knew there was a scar, a thin white line she had traced in the dark but never asked about. "We got caught in something bad, an ambush. I took a bullet that should have killed me." His voice grew hoarse. "David got me out, carried me 6 blocks to a hospital, bleeding out the whole way. He saved my life." "What happened to him?" "He didn't make it. Shot twice getting me to safety. He was dead before the doctors even started working on me." Vivian's hand covered her mouth. "Grace was 17 when her brother died. A kid, really. And she was left alone. Their mother was sick. Their father was long gone. David had been supporting them. And you..." Vivian began to understand. "I should have been there. For her, for their mother. But I was a coward. I couldn't face them. Couldn't face what David had done for me. So I ran. I built all this." He gestured at the study, the house, the empire beyond. "And I told myself that success would make up for abandoning them." "When did you find Grace again?" 3 years ago. Her mother had just died. Her son was sick. She was drowning, and I didn't even know she existed until a friend mentioned her name." His eyes finally met Vivian's. "I tracked her down, offered her a job. It was the least I could do." "She knows? About David?" "She knows I was there when he died. She knows I built everything on the chance he gave me." Marco's voice dropped. "She doesn't blame me. God knows why. She should." The room felt smaller somehow, the walls closer. Vivian had spent months constructing a narrative of betrayal, of lust, of her husband choosing another woman. The truth was both simpler and more devastating. Marco wasn't in love with Grace. He was atoning to her. And in that atonement, Vivian had seen him be kind, be present, be human in ways he had never been with her. Not because Grace was more desirable, but because Grace represented something Marco had failed, someone he owed. What did Vivian represent? A trophy. A performance. The appearance of a normal life wrapped around an abnormal man. He had married her because she was beautiful and connected, and wouldn't ask questions. He had never looked at her the way he looked at Grace because he had never felt guilty for failing her. She was just furniture. Expensive, well-maintained furniture that happened to speak. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her voice cracked. "Why did you let me think..." "What? That I was sleeping with the help?" His laugh was bitter. "Would you have believed me if I said I wasn't? Would you have cared about the real reason?" "I don't know." Honesty tasted like copper. "Maybe not. I was so convinced." "You were jealous." Marco said it, without accusation. "I know. I've seen it. The way you watch her, the way you treat her. I'm not proud of it. No. He stood, moving to the window, his back to her. But you weren't entirely wrong either. I do care for her. Not romantically, never that, but deeply. She's connected to the only pure thing I ever had in my life. David's friendship, David's sacrifice. And me? The question scraped out of her. What am I connected to? He turned, and his face held something like pity. Vivian, I don't know. I've never known. We've been married for 7 years, and I couldn't tell you why you stayed. Because I love you. The words came automatically, but they felt hollow, even as she spoke them. Do you? He asked it gently, without cruelty. Or do you love what I represent? The security, the status, the escape from whatever life you had before. She wanted to argue. She wanted to defend herself, to prove that her love was real and deep and not just a gilded cage she had walked into willingly. But the words wouldn't come, because Marco was right. She had been jealous of Grace, but not because she loved Marco. She had been jealous because Grace seemed to have something she didn't, a purpose, a real connection, something worth protecting. Vivian had a title. She had money. She had a house full of beautiful things. And she had nothing that mattered. The descent continued after that conversation, but it was internal now, a slow collapse of every story Vivian had told herself about her life. She stopped watching Grace with jealousy and started watching her with something like awe. This woman, who had lost her brother, nursed her mother through a long illness, and was now watching her son fight for his life. She got up every morning and worked with dignity and grace and not a shred of self-pity. What had Vivian done with her own suffering? Bought shoes, drunk too much wine, blamed a stranger for her empty marriage. She began making small changes. She asked Grace about Marcus, carefully, not intrusively, just expressing concern. Grace was guarded at first, but slowly began to share his treatments, his good days and bad days, his love of comic books, and his dream of being an artist someday. Vivian found herself sending gifts, anonymously at first, then openly. Art supplies, graphic novels, a tablet for digital drawing, nothing extravagant by her standards, but meaningful to a sick child. Grace didn't thank her effusively. She simply nodded, her eyes softening with something that might have been the beginning of trust. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't even the start of redemption. But it was something. One evening, Vivian found herself in Grace's room again, this time invited. Grace was showing her pictures of Marcus's latest artwork, and Vivian was genuinely marveling at the talent in this 12-year-old's hands. He gets it from David, Grace said quietly. My brother. He could draw anything, used to fill notebooks with sketches. Said someday, he'd design buildings, make something beautiful out of nothing. I'm sorry, Vivian said, that you lost him. Grace looked at her for a long moment. Your husband told you. Yes. And you're not angry that he keeps that part of his life from you? Vivian considered the question. I think I'm angry at a lot of things, but not that. Marco owes you a debt he can never repay. I understand now why he tries. Grace's expression shifted. Not warmer exactly, but less guarded. You're not what I expected, Mrs. Castellano. Vivian, please. And I'm not what I expected either. It was as close to friendship as they might ever get. But in that moment, in that small room with its photographs and books, Vivian felt more real than she had in years. The descent had brought her here, to rock bottom, to the worst parts of herself, to the recognition of everything she had gotten wrong. Now came the question, what would she do with the truth? The call came on a Thursday afternoon. Grace was in the kitchen, preparing for a small dinner party, just Marco and some legitimate business associates, nothing that required elaborate planning. Vivian was reviewing the seating chart when Grace's phone rang. She watched Grace's face as she answered, watched the color drain from her cheeks, watched her grip the counter like it was the only thing keeping her upright. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Grace's voice was mechanical, a shell over panic. Tell him I'm coming. Tell him Mama's coming. She hung up and stood frozen, staring at nothing. Grace. Vivian moved toward her. What happened? Marcus. The name came out broken. He collapsed. They're taking him to the hospital. They said it's bad. Vivian didn't think. She grabbed her keys from the counter. I'm driving you. Mrs. Castellano? Vivian, and you're in no condition to drive. We're going now." The drive to the hospital was silent, Grace rigid in the passenger seat, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone gray. Vivian broke every speed limit, ran 2 yellow lights, and pulled into the emergency bay in 18 minutes flat. "Go," she said to Grace. "I'll park and find you." Grace was out of the car before Vivian finished speaking, running through the sliding doors with a mother's desperate speed. Vivian parked in the first spot she found, a space reserved for some administrator whose name she didn't bother to read. Let them tow the car. Let them fine her $1,000. None of it mattered. Inside, the hospital was a maze of fluorescent lights and chemical smells. She found the pediatric oncology wing after 3 wrong turns and a helpful nurse who recognized the panic in her eyes. Grace was in a small waiting room, alone, still wearing her housekeeper's uniform. She looked utterly out of place among the pastel walls and cheerful posters. A woman dressed for serving appetizers, sitting in a plastic chair, waiting to learn if her child would live or die. Vivian sat beside her without speaking. After a moment, Grace's hand found hers and squeezed. They waited. Marco arrived an hour later, his face grim, his usual composure cracked at the edges. He took in the scene, his wife and his housekeeper, hands clasped, united in vigil. And, whatever he might have expected, this wasn't it. "Any news?" he asked. "Not yet." Grace's voice was hollow. "They took him for more tests." Marco sat on Grace's other side, and for a while, the 3 of them existed in that liminal space where money and power meant nothing. Just humans, waiting, hoping, praying to gods they might not believe in. The doctor came out at sunset. He was young. Too young, Vivian thought irrationally, to hold this kind of power, with kind eyes and a tired posture. "Mrs. Williams?" Grace stood so quickly she swayed. Marco steadied her with a hand on her elbow. "Marcus is stable," the doctor said, and the relief that crashed through the room was almost physical. "But I need to be honest with you. The cancer has progressed. The current treatment protocol isn't working. Without intervention, we're looking at weeks, maybe a few months." Grace made a sound, small, animal, devastating. "There is an option," the doctor continued. "There's a clinical trial at Johns Hopkins, experimental treatment, but the early results are promising. The problem is, it's expensive, very expensive, and there's a waiting list." "I can get him in," Marco said immediately, "and money isn't an issue." The doctor hesitated. "Mr. Castellano, I appreciate that, but the waiting list exists for a reason. There are protocols, ethical considerations." "I don't care about protocols." Marco's voice carried the edge of a man used to making the impossible happen. "I care about that boy. Name your price, name your conditions, whatever it takes." Vivian watched her husband transform before her eyes, not into the ruthless crime lord, but into something almost heroic. A man fighting for a child's life with every weapon at his disposal, and she knew, in that moment, what she needed to do. "Doctor," she said, stepping forward, "my husband can arrange the financial aspects, but I'd like to help with the waiting list." Marco looked at her sharply. "My maiden name is Vivian DeMarco," she continued. "My uncle is Senator Richard DeMarco. He serves on the Senate Health Committee." She pulled out her phone. "Let me make a call." 3 hours later, Marcus was enrolled in the Johns Hopkins trial. They would transfer him in the morning. The treatment would begin within the week. Grace wept, the first tears Vivian had ever seen from her, great shuddering sobs that seemed to pull everything from her body. Vivian held her, awkwardly at first, then fiercely, the 2 women clinging to each other in a hospital hallway, while Marco made arrangements and signed checks that would have made most people faint. "Why?" Grace finally asked, pulling back to look at Vivian. "Why are you helping me? After everything? The way I've seen you look at me, the things you must have thought, because I was wrong." Vivian's voice was steady. "Because I spent months hating you for something that existed only in my imagination. Because you deserved better from me, and this is the only way I know to start making it right. You don't owe me anything. Maybe not, but I owe myself something. I owe myself the chance to be the kind of person who helps when help is needed." Grace studied her for a long moment. "You're not what I expected either, Vivian Castellano." That night, after Marcus was settled and Grace was resting in a chair beside his bed, Vivian stood in the hospital corridor with Marco. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For today. For everything. Don't thank me. I should have been this person all along. None of us are who we should be." He looked through the window at Grace, exhausted but hopeful, holding her son's hand. "We just do our best with what we have. I want a different marriage, Marco." The words came out before she could second-guess them. "I don't want to be furniture anymore. I want to be a partner, a real one." He turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw something she hadn't seen in years: respect. "I don't know if I can be a good husband," he said honestly. "I don't know if I know how. Neither do I, but I think I'm done pretending that what we have is enough." She took a breath. "Can we try? Actually try?" The pause stretched, then Marco nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "We can try." It wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't a promise that everything would be better. But it was a beginning, real, fragile, and honest. The reckoning had come, and from its wreckage, something new was struggling to grow. 6 months later, the estate looked the same. Same manicured lawns, same iron gates, same marble and silk and crystal. But something fundamental had shifted, like a house that had been rebuilt from the inside without anyone touching the walls. Marcus Williams was in remission. The experimental treatment had worked, not perfectly, not permanently, but enough. He was back in school, back to drawing, back to being a 12-year-old with opinions about superheroes and complaints about homework. He still had checkups every month, still lived with the sword hanging over him, but for now, the sword had been sheathed. Grace still worked at the Castellano estate, but her role had evolved. She was no longer just the housekeeper, she was something closer to a family member, though none of them would have used that word. She had a seat at the dinner table now, when it was just the three of them. She gave opinions on matters beyond flower arrangements. She was seen. Vivian had changed most of all. She had started volunteering at a foundation for pediatric cancer research. Actually volunteering, not just writing checks. She spent 3 mornings a week at the hospital where Marcus had been treated, reading to children whose parents couldn't be there, organizing activities, simply being present for families in crisis. Her friends, Marco's associates' wives, didn't understand. Why would she waste her time with sick children when she could be lunching at the club? Why trade designer clothes for scrubs? Vivian didn't try to explain. She simply stopped accepting their invitations. The friendships withered, and she found she didn't miss them. Her marriage to Marco was still complicated, would always be complicated, given who he was and the world he operated in. But there was something real between them now. Conversations that lasted past midnight. Dinners where they actually talked. A shared project in Marcus's recovery that had bound them together in unexpected ways. They had started seeing a therapist, separately and together, though they told no one. In Marco's world, seeking help was weakness, but he went anyway, every Tuesday afternoon, because he had promised Vivian he would try. It wasn't love, exactly. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But it was something that had never existed before. Partnership. Respect. The possibility of growth. One evening in late September, Vivian found Grace in the garden, tending the roses that had been neglected during the months of crisis. The sun was setting, painting everything gold, and Grace's hands moved among the blooms with that familiar meditative grace. "They're beautiful," Vivian said, joining her. "I never paid attention before. How much work you put into them." Grace smiled, a real smile, unguarded in a way that was still rare between them. "Roses are like people. You can't force them to grow. You can only give them what they need and trust them to do the rest." Vivian knelt beside her, reaching out to touch a bloom the color of sunrise. "Grace, I never properly apologized for how I treated you those first years, the suspicion, the unkindness. You don't need to apologize. I do, because I understand now what I was really jealous of." Vivian plucked a dead leaf from the bush, focusing on the small task. "It wasn't about Marco, not really. It was you, the way you carried yourself, the way you found meaning in your work, in your love for Marcus, in just existing. I had everything, and I felt empty. You had nothing I could see, and you seemed complete." Grace was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't complete. I was surviving. That's different. Maybe, but you were surviving with dignity. I couldn't even manage that." You're managing it now? Grace's hand covered hers briefly. People can change, Vivian. I didn't think you would, but you have. That matters. Does it make up for the time I wasted? Nothing makes up for anything. That's not how life works. Grace stood, brushing dirt from her knees. You can only go forward. Do better tomorrow than you did today. They walked back to the house together, the sunset spreading copper and rose across the sky. In the kitchen, Marcus was sitting at the table, working on a drawing, a superhero of his own creation with the power to heal sick kids just by touching them. Mrs. Castellano, he looked up with the easy joy of children who haven't yet learned to be guarded. Look what I'm making. It's beautiful, Marcus. She meant it. What's his name? The Guardian. He protects people nobody else can see. Vivian felt something tighten in her chest. That's a wonderful power to have. I know. He returned to his drawing, tongue poking out in concentration. Everybody needs a guardian, even the people who look like they don't. Later that night, Vivian stood at her bedroom window, the same window where she had stood months ago, watching Grace in the garden and nursing a jealousy that had corroded her from inside. The estate was quiet now, wrapped in the particular stillness of autumn evenings. Somewhere below, Grace was putting Marcus to bed in the guest room that had become his, the room Vivian had insisted they prepare for him, so he could be close to his mother when he stayed over. Marco appeared behind her, his reflection joining hers in the dark glass. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How much time I wasted, being angry at the wrong things, blaming people who didn't deserve it. We all waste time." He put a hand on her shoulder. "The question is what we do with what's left. I want to do better." She turned to face him. "Not just for Grace or Marcus. For us. For me." "I know." His eyes, so often cold, held something warm. "I see you trying. Every day I see it. Is it enough? I don't know. But I'm trying too. Maybe that's all any of us can do." She leaned into him, and he held her, not with passion, but with something steadier. Two imperfect people, standing in the wreckage of their assumptions, trying to build something true. Downstairs she heard Marcus laugh at something Grace said, the sound bright and clear and alive. That boy was alive because of choices made in crisis, because Marco had carried a debt for 20 years and finally found a way to pay it, because Grace had worked with dignity through impossible circumstances, because Vivian had swallowed her pride and made a phone call. No single act of heroism, just ordinary people choosing kindness over resentment, honesty over comfort, connection over isolation. The truth doesn't break people, Vivian thought. The pretending does. She had stopped pretending. They all had. And in the space that opened up, something new was growing, fragile, imperfect, but real. Outside, the autumn wind stirred the roses Grace had tended with such care. They would sleep soon, retreat into themselves for the long winter. But they would return in spring, stronger for the rest, more beautiful for the pruning. That was the lesson, wasn't it? Some things had to be cut back to grow. Some truths had to be faced before healing could begin. Some relationships had to break before they could become something worth keeping. Vivian Castellano had learned to see what she had refused to see, the humanity in a woman she had dismissed, the emptiness in a life she had decorated, the possibility of change in a man she had stopped hoping could change. And Grace Williams had taught her, without ever meaning to, that dignity couldn't be bought or inherited or married into. It could only be earned day by day, choice by choice, even when no one was watching, especially when no one was watching. By morning, the estate would hum with its usual routines: coffee brewing, linens pressing, a household running on the invisible labor of people who deserve to be seen. But tonight, Vivian simply stood at her window, watching the stars emerge over the gardens, feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not happiness exactly. Peace was different, harder, more honest. The kind of peace that comes only after you've faced the worst in yourself and decided to become something better. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Marcus's cancer could return. Marco's world could collapse. The fragile trust between her and Grace could shatter. But tonight, in this moment, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. And that was enough. That was finally beautifully enough.